Well, I was born on a golf course in 1994. Played golf my whole life, but I can never get a good score. Oh, 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 hello there. Excuse me. Welcome to our next installment of Something Like a Sermon. It's good to see you again here. It's been a few weeks since we did this the last time. Today we're going to look at Matthew chapter 14, and we could have looked at Mark chapter 6, John chapter 6, Luke chapter 9. Today we'll be in Matthew 14. All of these are about the same event, the same narrative, the same miracle in the Gospels, which is where Jesus feeds the 5,000 people, 5,000 men besides women and children. So there was probably a lot more than 5,000 people. But this is a very significant miracle because it's the only one, and there are very few things that occur that are the same in all four Gospels and that are told in all four Gospels. And there's only one miracle that occurs in all four Gospels, and this is it. So there's something incredibly significant, something very profound about this miracle, about the loaves and the fish, the bread and the fish, the feeding of the 5,000, whatever name you want to call it. There's something very important about this, and it was important not just to the gospel writers, but to the first Christians as well. And we'll be talking about that more in a little bit. First, I just want to talk about something that I did yesterday with my family, and that was for the very first time I got to take my kids to a driving range to hit some golf balls. So my kids are 8 years old, 6 years old, 4 years old, and my wife and I have we've liked to play golf for a long time. We've liked to play golf together, but we haven't done that in a while in recent years because of life and kids and everything else going on. But our kids are finally getting old enough so that we can start doing some of this stuff again and do it with them, which is really cool. So we were at the driving range, and I didn't know what was going to happen. I know my two boys like to play golf in the backyard with some little wiffle balls or whatever. So I thought they would kind of like it. But what happened was way more than I expected. We got there, I bought a large bucket of balls, let them hit them for the most part, and they actually were doing really well. And then the bucket of balls was gone, and we just had an empty basket left. And they looked at me and said, "Dad, can we do some more? Can we hit another one?" I was like, "Well, okay." So they like this. So I'll go back in, get another bucket of golf balls, another basket of balls, and then come back out and let them hit it. And they were having a great time. They were doing some really awesome hits with all different clubs, and then the balls were gone again, and they looked at me and said, "Dad, can we hit some more?" And that blew me away. I didn't think they were gonna be lasting that long because we were already there for almost 2 hours, and so so they said we want to hit some more. So I did, and I went in and got a third bucket of balls, and I had to cut them off. They would have kept staying there all day. So it was a cool experience. But one of the coolest parts is I did end up hitting. I hit like 3 balls. I wanted them to hit most of them, but there were a few times where I did hit ones just to show them how to do something. And these are like the cool dad moments that you treasure, because if you remember when you're a little kid and you see your dad do something, it's like the greatest thing ever. So I took out my driver one time and I hit this awesome shot. Like I haven't hit a golf ball in like 400 years. It's been a while, but I teed it up and said a little prayer and hit that thing, and it was awesome. It was a bomb. It was like 390 yards. Just kidding, not that far, but it was perfect. And like their eyes got wide open. They're like, "Whoa, Dad, how do you do that? That's awesome." So that was a cool moment as a dad. And then and then I hit a couple more good shots. So they were amazed, right? They were impressed. They were amazed. And by the way, I kept buying them more and more golf balls. So it was a good day all around for them. I was thinking about that yesterday, and I've had this text in my mind all week. And I was thinking about the difference between my kids' experience yesterday and the the miracle story that we see in Matthew chapter 14. And I was thinking about Jesus and about God and about my perspective as a dad and about what to do in that situation. So here's what I mean. When we ran out of golf balls, my kids looked around, and all we had were empty baskets. And they said, "We don't have any more. We don't have anything." And they're asking for me to provide more golf balls for them in this case, right? Now there's two things I could do. I could say, "Hold on, I'll be right back," and then come back and have some more a basket full of balls, which that's what I did. Or I could have turned to them and said, "You figure out how to get them yourself. You produce a basket of golf balls." And obviously, I don't do that except as a joke, because it's basically impossible. They don't have any money. They don't have any way to get the golf balls. There's nothing they could do. It would have been sort of a ridiculous thing. Which is why I find it very interesting that in this miracle in Matthew chapter 14, and I'll assume you've been through the text already. If not, take a moment to read Matthew chapter 14, verses 13 through 21, and take a moment to familiarize yourself with the text here. But it's interesting. This is a miracle story, right? And it's the biggest one, the most important one that all four gospel writers include, except for like the resurrection and that sort of thing. But Jesus, when the disciples come to Jesus and they say, "Look, it's getting late in the night. We've been with these people all day. We've done everything that they've come for. Jesus, you've been teaching all day. You've given them the word." The text even says that Jesus was healing the sick, some of their sick, and with compassion, having compassion on them. What Jesus did not do is to say, "Hold on a second, I'll be right back," and then disappear behind the tree and then come out with a bunch of baskets of bread for everyone. Now, could he have done that? Yes. Would that have been a cool thing to do from the perspective as a father? Would that be something I would want to do to impress my children or wow them? Yeah, you can do that. I did that yesterday on the golf course. I hit this golf ball, and although by my standards, it was pretty good. That was something that was totally awesome to my kids. They've never seen anything like that before. You can do that as God. We can even do that stuff as dads when our kids are young enough and they don't know that we're not really as awesome as we look. But Jesus doesn't do that in this text. In fact, he does the opposite. He says, "You give them something to eat." And I think that's the most profound phrase here in the text. Jesus said to them, they don't need to go away. The disciples are asking for Jesus to send the disciples away so they can go find their own food, because they looked around and all they had were empty baskets, right? And then they looked around again and they said, "Well, we have empty baskets and maybe 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish." Okay. Well, that's not going to be enough for this many people. Jesus said, They don't need to be sent away. You don't need to send them away. You give them something to eat. Okay? Um, so they find 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. Clearly, obviously, not enough for 5,000 people, whatever, how many people there were, 5,000 plus people. You give them something to eat. What is Jesus doing here? Everybody knows. Jesus knows. The disciples know that's not going to work. But what this is about perspective. It's about the idea of scarcity. It's about the idea of abundance. It's about helping the disciples see something that they have not yet been able to see. And that is that there's a difference between what we see when we look around at our resources, our supplies, our gifts, our talents, and what Jesus sees when he looks at the very exact same things. These aren't pieces of bread. These aren't fish that Jesus brought. These aren't ones that he produced. This is what the group already had. And realistically, it wasn't a lot. You got 5,000 plus people, and you only have 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. That's not a lot. That's not a lot from our perspective. But I think this text is trying to help Jesus, and help the church, help the disciples. And if you can imagine how this functions for the first readers, the first century audience, the first recipients of Matthew's gospel, Mark's gospel, Luke's gospel, John's gospel, they all get this story because of how important it is. What does it mean to them? When you're a church, you are acutely aware of how lacking you are in certain areas. It might be certain areas related to gifts or talents. It might be numbers. It might be financial resources. There's a ton of stuff that we as a human organization, even a church, can look around it and say, I don't know how we can make it. I don't know how we're going to cut it. There's no way. And that's a very human response to situations. Jesus looks at this situation and says, what do you have? That's all he asks. Just show me what you have. It might even be so embarrassing. Like, okay, I don't even want to say this out loud, but all we have is 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. And it's embarrassing to say that. I wish we should have more. But that's all Jesus needs. I mean, it could have been 1 loaf of bread, it could have been 1 fish, whatever. But it was 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. That's all you need. Because, and I think this is part of the point, and I want this to be an open question for you, but this is, I'm offering my perspective here first, and hopefully you'll be able to build on that on your own, in your own households. When we take what we have, even though it seems like it's not enough, and when that passes through the hands of Jesus, there's more than enough. And that's the point. And I think that applies on a whole host of levels, individually, in your family, and our church congregation, for the church as a whole, worldwide. I think it can apply globally to the world as a whole. When we take what we have, whatever amount that is, and when that passes through the hands of Jesus, we'll come to find that it is more than enough. When we fail to give it to Jesus, when it doesn't pass through his hands first, we'll find that it isn't enough. 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish in the hands of the disciples will not feed very many people. But when those same 5 loaves and 2 fish first pass through the hands of Jesus and then returns to the hand of the disciples, they discover that it's not just enough, but that it's an abundance. It's more than enough. And there's 12 baskets that used to be empty that are now full at the end of the day when all we started with is 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. So that's, I think, the first question. When we look at our situation, whatever it is, personally, um, individually, as a household, as a congregation, um, whatever, do you see scarcity or do you see abundance? Have we disciplined ourselves as a church, as individuals, to look at things and to say, I know this isn't a lot, but I know that it's more than enough when it first passes through the hands of Jesus. So secondly, and I think I only have 2 today, so that's the first one. When I look at my life, my resources, my gifts, my talents, ours as a collective whole, as a church, do I see scarcity or do I see abundance? And do I remember that in the hands of Jesus, we have more than what we need? Secondly, we'll see in this text that Jesus, in verse 19, after ordering the people to sit down on the grass, and he has these 5 loaves and 2 fish, and the text says, he took the 5 loaves and 2 fish, looking up towards heaven, he blessed the food, then he breaks the loaves, and then he gives it to the disciples. And those 4 words are an important formula in the New Testament, in the Gospels, in Paul, and elsewhere, that when you take, when you bless, when you break, when you give, and that those words might even be familiar to you because you've heard Jesus do that elsewhere. You hear that happening in the first century church as well. That is a really important formula in Scripture, and it becomes what you might call a Eucharistic formula. In other words, that formula is tied to the Eucharist, the Lord's Supper, communion. Eucharist is just a Greek word that means thanksgiving, and that's the word that very early on, in the first century, was the word assigned to the communion meal, the Lord's Supper, that the church celebrates on a regular basis. So Eucharist is sort of like the official fancy Greek word for the same thing. We're talking about communion, we're talking about the Lord's Supper. The Eucharist is this act of giving thanks, or you could, instead of the giving of thanks, you could replace that with this word for blessing, which is part of the formula here. Took, blessed, broke, and gave. Anyway, we see this formula here in this miracle, which when you read this story of the 5,000, you would think, okay, this isn't the Last Supper. This isn't the church celebrating the Lord's Supper. What would this have to do with the Eucharist, with communion, with the Lord's Supper? But when you hear that formula, that's exactly what the first Christians would think about, because that's what that formula is: taking, blessing, breaking, giving. And what I want to just point out real quickly here, and what I think is really interesting, is that when you look, for example, in the Roman catacombs of the early 2nd century, you find frescoes of depictions of different things about the church, and there's artwork there that depicts the celebration of communion, of the Eucharist, of the Lord's Supper. If you would have asked a first century Christian or early 2nd century Christian, tell me what things you need to celebrate the Lord's Supper, they would have said, well, you need the wine, and you need the bread, and you need some fish. Or at least that's what we can gather from these early works of art. Because in the Roman catacombs, there are frescoes that depict celebrations of the Eucharist, of the Lord's Supper, of communion. And there you have people reclined around the table, and you see clearly there's the wine, the bread, and there's fish, and sometimes there's even some empty baskets, or baskets that have bread in them that are full, depicted either in the front or in the background, that sort of thing. Now, what does that mean? Is this literal? Does the Lord's Supper include fish and baskets and stuff? I don't know. It's art. Um, but what they're saying is that there is a very strong, very important, very profound connection between what happens in the Lord's Supper and what is happening here in this text in Matthew 14, in this feeding of the 5,000. It's the same formula, and the early church understood that there is a strong relationship. And that's the second question I want to ask for us to explore today. You can explore it on your own. I'll say just a couple of things here, but it's really, really interesting, really profound thing to explore. There is some reciprocal mirror image here between the Lord's Supper, the Eucharist, and this story of the feeding of the 5,000. What is that? What do they have in common? Why does the early church, why do the gospel writers themselves demonstrate that? Why is Jesus' language Eucharistic with that formula? What is this description about? What is the relationship between the two? So, and I want to think about that myself, and what that means is whatever's happening, part of what's happening in the Lord's Supper, whatever that is also occurring in this situation in Matthew 14 with the crowds. In the Lord's Supper, there's some sort of encounter with Jesus, and there is food involved, there is nourishment involved. So there's something about that when we take the Lord's Supper, when we commune together in the Lord's Supper, in a sense, Jesus is providing abundance, providing all that we need and more in life. Or from the other perspective, when through our hands, having first passed through the hands of Jesus, we minister to other people as Christians, as a church. When we provide for others in a very physical, tangible way, like bread and fish to hungry people. Or you can take that, spiritualize it metaphorically, and say when we help people in any kingdom of God spiritual way. When we provide bread and fish to the hungry, somehow there is a Eucharistic function, effect there. That somehow it is a powerful encounter with the risen Jesus through that act of giving, receiving bread, fish. So that's a start. There's something that's the same in both, and I want to invite you to explore that as well. What other connections are there? What is the connection in the relationship, the reciprocity between this this ministry of feeding and the Lord's Supper, the Eucharist, communion itself? So those are the two questions. What's the relationship between the two? How does that work itself out in our lives? And secondly, when we look at our life, when we look at our church, do our eyes see scarcity or do they see abundance? Blessings to you on this Lord's Day.